Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go, Washington Policy's Center podcast of news, interviews, and policy analysis.
These farm halls, in case you're wondering what they are, we have them every fall, and they are an opportunity for members of the public, farmers, and other folks, some of whom we'll talk about in a minute, are an opportunity for all of these folks to get together and talk about policy topics. So policy is interesting because it's what guides lawmakers and legislation. So it sounds like a fancy way of saying, decision making essentially. And farm halls are a good way to make it personal because you get to talk to people who are directly involved in those policy decisions. And I will introduce this panel to you here shortly as well. This is the second farm hall out of 3 that we are having this fall. We had one in Yakima last month, and we will have our last one next month in the Tri-Cities. So if any of y'all are interested in a road trip in November, feel free to come see us again. Today we're going to talk about mostly tree fruit, but I imagine in that discussion we'll also talk a little bit about labor and marketing and trade and some other things, WSU Extension as well, and some of those other things that get folded into policy discussions in general. To tell you a little bit more about the Ag Center and these fine folks here. The Ag Center was started approximately 3 years ago with the support of some of the fine folks from Northwest Farm Credit Services, as well as private donors. I believe McDougall and Sons were part of that support. And what supporters found, and the Tree Fruit Association as well, and what spurred that start of my particular office was a gap in the policy discussion about agriculture. So thus began my office and brought us all eventually here today. So today we're going to talk with Brian McDougall, who's the vice president of McDougall and Sons, Scott McDougall, who is
janitor, actually.
I heard it was a little bit different than that.
I'm president. So,
okay.
Yeah.
John Devaney, who's the president of the Tree Fruit Association, and David Granite, who works here part-time, I believe, at the...
Very part-time. I'm retired.
At the Tree Fruit Research Center here. And then we will also hear from Mandy Minnick with Northwest Farm Credit at the tail end of the presentation today. And we're going to also give you all the opportunity to visit with Commissioner Bugert, who's in the back here. Thank you for coming today, Commissioner. We appreciate it. And the way this will go, we'll have some panel discussion, and then we'll all have the opportunity to sort of mix and mingle, have a few drinks, have a few snacks, and try to wrap this thing up and get everybody home in time for supper. Sound like a plan? Great. So, Brian, you want to start us off with a little bit better intro about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So Brian McDougall with McDougall and Sons. I'm a 5th generation farmer. My role in the company is mainly around the warehouse, packing side of the business, as well as dealing with our marketing arm, CMI Orchards, on general movement issues, situations, as well as just working on strategies for some of our proprietary varieties. We have the Ambrosia apple. We're also a part of the Enza group out of New Zealand, which has Jazz, Envy, and Pacific Rose. So working with our sales team on sales strategies to move those varieties and gain a bigger presence in the retail space.
Good. Scott McDougall, I guess I've been in the business now 45 years. I'm getting old enough and I'm losing track. Anyway, grew up here, went to Wenatchee High School, graduated from University of Washington. Sorry, Cougars. Came back and started repairing bins, and then was involved with my brother at that time in running a warehouse, really just the two of us, and then ventured out into the orchard side. Really enjoyed that, and so I more or less head up the orchard division and management, and I think we're farming somewhere around 4,100 to 4,200 acres, which has really grown rapidly in the last 15 years, primarily because of what Brian had mentioned with our club varieties. It really gave us something to plant that we thought we could make a little bit of money at, and so that's really been where all of our growth has occurred. So
I'm John Mannion, the president of the Washington State Tree Fruit Association. I recognize a lot of our members here in the room. We represent all the apple, pear, and cherry growers, packers, and marketers here in the state of Washington. Primarily, we work on state and local public policy issues. We do education for the industry, including publishing statistics on what things have been selling for, how much product remains in inventory, and so on. And we put on other educational events like the annual meeting and Hort Show, which will be here in Wenatchee from the 9th through the 11th of December this year. The public policy side of things is not what most farmers are in the business to be involved in, but it comes and finds you. So we do our best to represent you on these issues, and we really appreciate the partnership of the Washington Policy Center on really getting a lot of good free market, pro-ag information out to legislators that comes from a statewide, unbiased source. So they're a really key partner for all of us.
I'm David Granite from WSU. I actually retired about a year ago, but I'm still emeritus, so I'm still related to the university. I worked here for about 25 years, right here in this building, on various aspects of tree fruit as well as other production systems. My job was designed to focus on sustainability. So starting in late 80s, early 90s, this was a interesting policy football that was being kicked around the country. And a lot has changed in that time, where most of our major corporations have sustainability programs now. They're taking it more and more seriously, and that's being pushed down to suppliers and growers, and it's part of how the world works today. So I've worked a lot in that arena.
Well, thank you all for coming today. We appreciate having you all on the panel. And David, I'm actually going to start with you. Rosemary and I had a discussion earlier this week about extension and WSU in particular. So could you talk a little bit about the sustainability aspect here at the Extension Center, and how you think that that's helping the industry? I know.
Yeah. So do you want me to talk about
Sure.
extension or no, per se, or?
Let's start with the sustainability aspect.
Well, the history is interesting at WSU, and I've been part of it for most of the period that has been going on. Actually, not entirely. If you read back in the late 1800s, people were talking about sustainability issues. When they broke out a lot of the wheat fields and the Palouse, after 10 years, yields went from 60 bushels to 10 or 5 because of soil erosion. So people figured out pretty quickly, this isn't going to last, folks. And so it's been on the radar for actually many, many years. At more recent time, I would say probably the mid Mid-'80s, we had the whole farm crisis in the U.S., particularly in the Midwest. It didn't hit us here in quite the same way. But in the Midwest, farmers left and right were going bankrupt at the same time that they couldn't drink their water because of pollution of groundwater. And it just went, what are we doing wrong here? This was a really, really big deal. So the 1985 Farm Bill, which is policy at the federal level, set out some new thinking around sustainability, and that's where you really started to see things change from a policy perspective. At WSU, per se, I would say we had faculty members interested in some of the issues being raised back in the late 80s, and they were having projects going and whatnot. In I think it was 89, the state of Iowa established the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, and that was a big deal because it was the first time a university actually formally created a sustainability program inside the institution. So that sort of set the pace. You know, Iowa is the heart and soul of a lot of U.S. agriculture, and this was a big deal. The focus was to do research and extension on alternative methods that basically could be profitable and didn't pollute the wells. So, you know, it made a lot of sense. And they actually taxed fertilizers and pesticides to pay for that research. It was very innovative. And people went, wow, if this could happen in Iowa, this is kind of remarkable. So it spilled over to here in Washington. In '92, the legislature passed an enabling legislation to establish the Center for Sustaining Agriculture and Natural Resources at WSU, and that's who I've worked for since 1993. So we've done many, many things over the years. I would say in some ways in the early 90s, because it was politically very contentious issue. Nobody wants to be told they're not sustainable. That's, you know, a lot of hard feelings happened around that. But I would say since that time period, it's become embedded in a lot of what we do. And in many ways, it's just normal life. Just like I said with the business world, it's now part of normal life. Whereas 20 years ago, there were incredible cartoons and all this really duking it out in the media about sustainability. You don't see that anymore. So we do a lot of research and extension on practices that can further economic, environmental, and social well-being on farms and in our food system. Is that getting where you want? Okay.
So Scott, what are you all doing to sort of incorporate some of that stuff that David's talking about?
Well, you know, as our retailers have, I guess I'm going to go into the organic world here a little bit more, which, as I told my friends on the coast, if you want to pay $2 more a pound for organic, that's fine, but I think all things being equal, you're not going to live any longer than I am. That was our attitude. But as our retailers requested more and more organic, and the growth is there, of course, for our customers, we had to have the tonnage. So we've really, in the last particularly 5, 6, 7 years, we've really kind of converted over. As I think about sustainability, what do we do? Of course, we lost the use of synthetic fertilizers, post-bloom thinners, and really, and I always think of it as the big three, and what are the big changes, really? Also, herbicide use. So we've actually come to, you know, we have to rely on chicken compost. We're building organic matter. We've used other prilled organic fertilizers, but and we've learned how to use chemical thinners, which primarily is really only, and maybe I'm getting a little too much information, but with lime sulfur, we've really kind of got one shot organically to do our thinning. And even with conventional programs, the more effective thinning has always been early, not later on millimeters. So we've really learned a lot organically, and we've used a lot of that, I think, in our conventional practices. And dependent on what cultivar you're farming, some are more friendly for return bloom anyway. So some of the ups and downs that people had initially with organic farming, we haven't had, but I think I attribute a lot of that too with higher tree densities. We've put them in closer so we don't need the growth, and we've really, in our programs, we really don't go to organic day one. We usually just force the trees hard for a couple of years. We get the canopy filled in, and we give up those 2 years, and then we're in a 3-year transition. But I'm very happy to say that doing those practices that way, I think we've kind of found out that we really haven't given up a whole heck of a lot. And I think that we've learned from organic farming maybe to farm conventionally, probably a little more like organic. One of the reasons I was never that excited to go organic was I thought we were so close anyway, as we kept losing organophosphates, and really the differences did come down to the synthetic fertilizers and everything else. I think as an industry we probably could have done better. I know in Europe they really have conventional farming. They've figured out a way with the chemicals they have to have zero residue by the time they sell. So they're not going organic as much as they're really selling that to the consumer, zero residue.
Integrated production.
Right, and they're getting value added with that without technically, going through all the hoops that organic is. So, I'm thinking, do we blow? We use basically a tiller and organic. We're incorporating that back into the soil. Surprisingly, years of chicken compost use, putting organic matter back into the soil. Even in conventional blocks where we've struggled, we'll use chicken compost. And, after 3 or 4 or 5 years of doing a regular program of that, we've really kind of made those trees pretty happy. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but in the field, sustainability, I guess that's kind of where we're at. And we've learned a lot from organic, and we actually are using a lot of the organic methods in our conventional farming.
But really, your whole IPM program is absolute sustainability.
Well, it is anyway. Yeah. I mean, even to the point where I guess actually one of our lenders just sent me an email last night and said, "Are you releasing sterile moths with drones?" And I said, "I've read of it, but I said we don't do it, but I don't know on a conventional basis how much. I think that's probably cutting edge, but there's a lot of new things that are out there on the horizon and different ways to farm that are going to make our product even safer, I think."
So, Brian, how does that track with general marketing?
Well, it's the same thing. I mean, it's a lot of it's being pushed down from the top from the retailers, but that's driven by the consumers. The big hot button word right now is plastic. And it's interesting because you've got a new generation of consumers who want it quick and easy and convenient, and they don't want to go into the store to pick it up. They want it delivered. And how do you align that want with how am I going to deliver that? And still plastic is the most effective tool that we have right now to get our product to a consumer without them having to pick it up themselves. I think where science is headed, where the innovation is heading, is really how plastic is made, the resins, what's the chemistry behind it, is it biodegradable, is it compostable, those sorts of things, recyclable. I think we're there for the most part, but they want, now it's the next step, and I think that's where a lot of the work's happening, and a lot of it's being driven again by the Costcos of the world, who have a kind of a higher level consumer, probably more active, in politically, a little more engaged, a little more maybe intellectual, and they're really kind of pushing back down on, give us something that is more environmentally friendly, and that's now the challenge for us, is to come up with a solution that kind of checks that box for them.
John, I told you I was going to ask you the hard question.
Oh, okay.
So, do you want to talk about trade and all of this?
All of that. Wow.
All of it.
Okay.
Tell
Sure.
us all about trade.
Well, I think that the first thing to keep in mind is that folks who are growing for specific customers, whether they be an organic versus a conventional customer, are also thinking about growing for particular customers in foreign markets. The days when we grew one or two kinds of apples and 2/3 of our production was in red and golden delicious is behind us, and so we're picking varieties and sizes and grades to target particular international customers, and we're making multi-million-dollar investments in perennial crop orchard systems. It can cost $50,000 or more per acre to establish an apple orchard, and if you talk about a typical block being 200 acres, that's a lot of money very quickly. And if you're targeting a particular export customer and then because of trade disputes you do not have access to that customer, that's extremely disruptive. Because when we were all growing the same apple, it was very easy to say, well, if you're not sending it to this customer, that's fine, I'll send it to that one instead. But the example I use is we all have our coffees that we want now. We all used to drink Folgers, right? And now everyone has their coffee order at Starbucks, right? And if you do not get your pumpkin spice latte, you're not ready to swap out an Americano. That's not acceptable to you. Our Apple customers think the same thing. If they can't get their organic Cosmic Crisp that they want, they're not necessarily saying, fine, I'll take a conventional Gala instead. They want what they want. And so if you've produced for that particular customer and see a disruption in international trade circumstances, that is extremely harmful to growers who've committed millions of dollars to that production. So as much as we want to see some of these trading systems brought more into a fairer alignment, it does affect us a lot. Another thing to keep in mind is the interaction of these dynamic systems. It's not just about the tariff rates. For example, a lot of people say, well, shouldn't it be easier just to sell your product domestically? I often have to remind folks that we have a huge transportation advantage when we're sending to Latin American and Asian export markets. It costs, and the trade, the freight rates are always fluctuating, but it costs approximately $4,000 to send a container of fruit to China, for example, if that was your export customer. About 30% of that cost is just getting the product from Wenatchee to the port of Seattle or Tacoma. So when we talk about traffic in the central Puget Sound or gas tax rates here in the state of Washington, that disproportionately affects our overall shipping costs. And then when I say it costs, we have an advantage there, the cost of sending that same container of fruit by truck to the East Coast is 2 or more times as much. It's $8,000 to $10,000 per truckload, per container load of fruit to truck it to the East Coast. So we have a huge transportation and price advantage exporting product. So when we talk about policy changes to transportation or easily shifting product, theoretically, from an export market to a domestic market, there's a big cost impact on those who have to grow and sell these products. They're going to have to make pricing adjustments that are not in their favor in order to move it domestically instead.
Look at you, smoothing it right over. I like it.
Since you paused, I'm gonna add another thing that a lot of folks don't think about, that some of the other panelists have already talked about, which is that these are dynamic systems. We often have consumers, for example, when talking about sustainability, who say local is inherently good. There's a reason that more than 90% of the organic fruit is grown in Washington state. We have natural climatic advantages, which mean that we can grow organically when a lot of other states can't, because we have favorable conditions, which means even if we're growing conventionally, we're often using far fewer inputs than other states are. And so these are interconnected issues. It's not just necessarily more sustainable to buy locally, because sometimes that producer in Washington, for example, is the more sustainable option for a consumer on the East Coast than their local product might be. And also consumers tend to think some foods are good and some are bad. They wear the vegan virtue hat, right? Well, if you're needing these animal byproducts, the dairy nutrients, the chicken nutrients, as our livestock friends like to call it, for organic fruit production, if everyone switches to an all vegetable and fruit diet, though that's nice in the short run, where are we going to get the organic inputs for organic production in these fruit and vegetable crops? So these systems are extremely complex in a way that a lot of our consumers and public policymakers really don't understand.
That's a great point, because you start looking at things like carbon footprint, which there's more and more demand that food products carry that information to the consumer. And things like nitrogen footprint is exactly what John is saying. So much of the nitrogen used on an organic farm actually came from synthetic fertilizers through an animal and ended up on that farm. It's a big percentage. So even though we think we've separated ourselves from the synthetic process, we haven't in many aspects.
Thanks for listening to Washington Policy on the Go. If you liked it, tell a friend and share this episode on your social media. Send any questions or comments to us at washingtonpolicy@washingtonpolicy.org.